Good to be here this evening. Been looking forward to this ever since Eric contacted me. Eric said earlier, sometimes the way my lessons work out are a little different than what you may hear. Well, there's a reason for that. Number one, I'm not an evangelist. And I've known y'all for several years, so y'all know that I'm a teacher. And so it is my goal as a teacher that you learn. And whether it's something very practical, we kind of had some practical lessons last time, all the different principle lessons. Well, this is something a little bit different, but I am hopeful that everybody will learn. And as a teacher, it doesn't matter where you end up on the bell curve. If you're on whatever end you are, everybody needs to learn something. So even from the youngest that we have in the audience to those who have been around a while, everybody needs to learn something. And I think with this topic, I think you will. Second thing I figured out is I'm not an expert. And so as we start to talk about these feasts of the Lord, I'm not an expert on this at all. I've just done a little bit probably more study than maybe most folks have. Because third thing I realized, when I get off on these wild tangents, one of the first things I do, I usually contact Carl Johnson, who's an evangelist up in Ada, Oklahoma. Some of you all probably know Carl. And I'll see if he has any type of resources or if he knows of any books that maybe some of the preachers have written. And when I told him what I was going to do, he said, I don't know of any. So I got to thinking, well, this may be something interesting then. Because there's some secular writings on it and some denominational. They kind of take a little bit of a different approach. But I wanted to look at what the Feast of the Lord. And there's one verse that really is going to be pertinent to our discussion today. So go ahead and memorize it. It's Colossians 2:14. And so we'll flash it up here in a second, but it is very important. So tonight we're going to talk about an overview of the Feast of the Lord. The Feast of the Lord, and don't worry, there's going to be a quiz at the end, so you better take good notes. The major, most important chapter when we're talking about the Feast of the Lord is Leviticus chapter 23. Leviticus chapter 23 enumerates the Feast of the Lord. There's 7 of them. Again, I don't think it's a coincidence that there's 7. We realize how important that number is in God's eyes and in the Bible. Leviticus 23:1, and the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, Speak to the children of Israel, and say to them, The feast of the Lord, which ye shall proclaim to be holy convocations, these are my feasts. So as we go through this series of lessons, you're going to hear me refer to these not as the feast of the Jews. These are not the Jewish feasts. These are the feasts of the Lord. They are God's feasts. They were set up with a purpose in mind, and there was a reason for each one of them. Now, as I was doing the study back home, each one of these topics was its own lesson. So, to keep us from being here about 4 hours every service, I've tried to compile them. So there's a whole bunch of information that I'm kind of skimming through or I may glaze over. Hopefully this will pique your interest a little bit, and you may study some more about the different feasts of the Lord. But always go back to Leviticus 23, because this is where it all starts from. This is where the feast of the Lord are enumerated. Here's my verse, Colossians chapter 2, verse 16. I think I said 14, it was verse 16. Colossians 2:16. Paul is writing to a group of people here in Colossae in the first century, many who had come out of Judaism. And so they had been observing, hopefully, these feasts of the Lord. Hopefully they had been celebrating things the way they were supposed to. Hopefully they had taken the Sabbath day as something that was holy. Hopefully they had followed the different sacrifices because they were godly people. And then all of a sudden, a change comes on, and here comes this Christianity. Well, there wasn't Facebook, and there wasn't a news channel that announced, all Jews, Messiah has come. It took a while. And there was a great transition period, and there was a lot of questions about how should the Jews and the Gentiles, these Christians, how should now they all come together? Can we be Jew and Christian? Do we need to be part Christian and part Jew? Do we still need to observe the Sabbath day? There were a lot of questions. And here we are 2,000 years later, we go, it all makes sense. To the people who were called in the moment, I tell you, I don't think you did. They were very confused as to what their responsibility was to God. These were good, godly folks. Paul writes to them and says, So let no one judge you in food or in drink, or regarding a festival, or a new moon, or Sabbaths, which are a shadow of things to come, but the substance is of Christ. So the question has been answered. We don't need to be judged in accordance to whether or not we observe the Passover, or the Feast of Unleavened Breads, or First Fruits, or the Feast of Weeks, or the Feast of Trumpets, or the Feast of Tabernacles, any of these feasts we're going to talk about, we're not held accountable to that. So don't let me be judged in that. Or in the food or drink, we don't have to follow the Jewish law of Moses' food and diet restrictions. We can eat pork if we would like. We can have a sausage sandwich if we would like to. We don't have to worry about the new moon, which you probably never even thought about before. After tonight, I hope you do. We don't have to worry about whether we're held to the Sabbath day and the restrictions of the Sabbath, how far we can walk, if we can pick up sticks or whatever it is. But verse 17 is what caught my eye. It says all of these things, it says, are a shadow of things to come, and the substance is of Christ. In other words, every one of these things, the food and drink restrictions, the festivals, the feasts, the new moon, the Sabbaths, everything pointed to Jesus. It was a shadow of what was to come through Christ. How? How was it a shadow? And that's what we're going to talk about. So I'm going to give you a quick overview tonight. So here's my first question. Why study if Christians are not to be judged by the festivals? If we're not held accountable to the Passover, who cares? Why should we study it? Well, I think there's a good answer there. And the answer is these ancient events served as a shadow of Christ. And if we really want to understand Christ, we need to understand as much as we can. And if we can figure out how this all fits together, to still the word that y'all are using for your yearly study, how things are connected. You want to talk about some connections? You're going to come across some connections tonight. So I hope I pique your interest, and even though I may not cover it fully, that you'll begin to study on your own, because it's fascinating. So I hope by the end of this little weekend meeting, you're just going to go, wow, I've never thought of that before. That's my goal. There are 7 feasts of the Lord. They are broken into basically 2 parts. There's the spring and the fall. And so what you may not recognize as we go through these, especially in the spring, those first 3 were just bam, bam, bam. In fact, it would all occur in about a week's time, depending on when the new moon fell. There was the Passover, the Feast of Unleavened Breads, the Feast of First Fruits, and then 50 days later, it was known as the Feast of Weeks. Now, we're more familiar with how the New Testament renders it. It calls it Pentecost. And that's the Greek rendering of that Hebrew word. It's the Greek, it means 50. So we had Passover, unleavened bread, first fruits, and then the Feast of Weeks or Pentecost. Then the summer came. And there was a 4-month period where there were no feasts. And then we get to the fall. And then again, in very close succession, we had the Feast of Trumpets, the Day of Atonement, and the Feast of Tabernacles. And I went ahead and put some of the more common Jewish phrases. Trumpets is called Rosh Hashanah. They still celebrate that today. Atonement is called Yom Kippur. And that is referred to as the holiest day in the Jewish calendar. That Yom Kippur means the Day of Atonement, literally. And so that goes back to the Feast of the Lord. You also hear the Feast of Tabernacles referred to as the Feast of Booths. And in fact, a lot of these have multiple names. And so sometimes it gets kind of confusing as we go through it. But these are the 7 feasts that we're going to look at. So here's our overview. Tomorrow night the plan is to discuss the spring. Sunday morning we're going to discuss the fall feast. And there's a reason for that, because there's some tie-ins I hope that you'll see. Sunday afternoon, I don't know. I know what I put on that little piece of paper. I may change it. There are 2 lessons that I'm kind of tossing back and forth. One is the summertime. What happens in between. And I've also got a lesson I call Christian Strength, which is kind of an application of the Feast of the Lord. So either way, we'll come up with something that hopefully will be interesting to you. So there's our outline. So you might have a question. Have you ever heard of something called Hanukkah? How does Hanukkah fit into all of this? Have you ever heard of something called Purim? Where do those fit into the Feast of the Lord? Well, the answer is those feasts were developed after the time of Leviticus 23. So I would not consider these feasts of the Lord. These are feasts of the Jews. There was a reason for each one of these. Purim, you may remember. Remember the story of Esther? Remember the story of how Esther had grown into the position of the queen of that country, and her uncle Mordecai came across a plot to kill all the Jews. And it was through Esther and Mordecai they were able to turn the tables on this fellow by the name of Haman. Haman was the guy, if you were Nazi Germany, he'd be Heinrich Himmler. He was the one who was behind this plan to exterminate the Jews. And so Esther and her uncle Mordecai were able to turn the tables on it, and the Jews prevailed against the country. And it was said, well, we need to have a celebration for this. So it's not a feast of the Lord, but the Jews came up with this idea, and it's found in Esther 9:26. So they called these days Purim, after the name Pur. Therefore, because of all the words of this letter, what they had seen concerning this matter, and what had happened to them. So the Feast of Purim was to be a feast that reminded them of this time when Esther and Mordecai had led the Jews to salvation against a guy by the name of Haman. So you've heard of that? It is not a feast of the Lord. That is a feast of the Jews. It was done many centuries later. We also have what's called the Feast of Dedication. And you find that in John chapter 10, verse 22. It says, now it was the Feast of Dedication in Jerusalem, and it was winter. I think it's interesting that the phrase is in there, and it was winter, because the Feast of the Lord occurred in the spring, and they occurred in the fall. So now it says we have the Feast of Dedication. It says it's in the winter. That's Hanukkah. At least that's what they call it now. Or sometimes you'll see it called the Festival of Lights. It is about the same time as the Christian holiday of Christmas. And so I've even heard Hanukkah referred to as the Jewish Christmas. That's not what it is. This was a feast that was established by the rabbis. It was called the Feast of Dedication. Festival of Lights had a whole production that went along with it. Had nothing to do with Jesus, obviously. This was not a feast of the Lord. This was a feast of the Jews. So we have the Feast of Dedication, or Hanukkah, and Purim were feast of the Jews. They were not feast of the Lord. They were not part of the original 7. So what are the feasts of the Lord? Well, you're going to come across the phrase over and over as you read Leviticus 23, which I would suggest that's part 1 of homework. Read Leviticus 23. It's kind of boring because it talks about all the different sacrifices and what had to happen and how many days and what all the people had to sacrifice, how many bulls and goats. It gets kind of tedious, but it's impressive. It was a holy convocation. A holy convocation, that word means it was something that God summoned the people. He would call the people together. The entire nation of Israel was assembled, and it was initiated by God. That was part of the Feast of the Lord. It was not something that man came up with. It was something that God came up with. Literally, it means the appointed times of the Lord. So God set in place when these feasts were going to occur. And we're going to talk about when. Kind of interesting, because we're going to talk a little bit about the calendar that God established. Pretty interesting. There were 3 certain feasts that required the presence of every Jewish male of a certain age in the city of Jerusalem. There were 3. There was the Passover, there was the Feast of Weeks, and there was the Feast of Tabernacles. The other 4 you could celebrate on your own, but those 3, every Jewish male over a certain age, I believe it was 21, was required to go to Jerusalem for the feast. Now think about it, and you're going to start seeing things that start falling into pieces. Talk about connections. Do you remember how on the day of Pentecost? I mean, on the Feast of Weeks in the New Testament when the church was established. Do you remember how the Spirit fell upon the apostles and they began to speak in tongues? And it says there were people from, and it starts listing them in Acts chapter 2. It begins listing all these different countries where these people were from, and they're amazed. They said, how are we hearing this in our own tongue? And it lists probably 10, 15 different locations around the world where these people were from. Well, why were they in Jerusalem? Because it was the Feast of Weeks. They were required to be in Jerusalem because it was a Feast of the Lord. And the time of the Feast of Weeks, that's when they were supposed to be. So you'll start picking up on some little tidbits, I hope, that are interesting, and then talk about these feasts of the Lord and how the connections fall in. Every feast had a different purpose and a different function. And as we break it into our smaller groups on Saturday and Sunday morning, I'll try to get into a little bit of that as best as possible. Again, I'm no expert on this. But each one, some were feast of remembrances of what had happened. The Passover, obviously, is the most common. It was a reminder how they had escaped from Egypt. The Feast of Tabernacles was a celebration. The Day of Atonement was a solemn day. There wasn't celebrating. There was a day of fasting. It was quiet. It was orderly and structured. Tabernacles was a celebration. Sometimes the sacrifice was burned completely to the Lord. Sometimes bits and pieces of the sacrifice were burned, and the rest of the animal was cooked for the people. It was a barbecue. It was a big old party. It depended on what God required for each certain feast. And they're all a little bit different. The feast also, and this is so important, serve as a type and anti-type relationship from the Old Testament to the New Testament. And that's what I want to focus the most on in our study, is how it's a type and anti-type from the Old Testament to the New Testament. Because remember what it said in Colossians? That everything, all of these feasts, it was a shadow of things to come. And that it was, the substance was of Christ. All of this is somehow pointing to Jesus, if we can just study a little bit and maybe we can figure it out. He said again, so that no one judge you in food or in drink, or regarding a festival or a new moon or Sabbath, which are a shadow of things to come, but the substance is of Christ. What was the Apostle Paul talking about when he said the substance is of Christ? That's my goal. I'll find you a calendar. Have you ever studied anything about maybe the Passover and it won't give you a straight date of when it occurs? The reason is because the Jewish calendar, or God's calendar, is not like ours. Our calendar is based on the sun. God's calendar is not. God's calendar is based upon the moon. And so it's based off of the cycles of the moon. And the days kind of move around a little bit. And so if you ever looked up Passover, it's kind of frustrating. If you're ever trying to figure something out, it'll say Passover and it'll say March, April. Because you never know quite when it's going to fall. It's going to fall sometime between March to April. And we like knowing dates. We like to know March 17th is St. Patrick's Day. Not that anybody cares, but we like to know what day it is. Okay, the Passover was not like that. It was based upon two things. The moon, and you're going to like this, it was based upon the barley feast, or the planting of barley. That's what determined when the year started and when the month started. Kind of an amazing thing. So as you kind of look, I'm trying not to, sorry Kathy, I can move a little bit. This first month right here, this is, and we'll talk about this in a minute, this is actually the Babylonian word, Nisan. See how it falls on March and April? So it's not always going to fall on the same time as the year goes. So that's why I like this. It kind of gives you a circular, so you kind of see where our months fit in. But I want you to notice, you know how everything happened very quickly? All of these occurred in the first month. Passover, unleavened bread, and first fruits were all within about a week, relatively short period of time. There was then 50 days, and we had the Feast of Weeks. Then there was nothing during the summer months. When we get to the fall, again, it's going to happen very quickly. Feast of Trumpets, Day of Atonement, Tabernacle. Now, this particular calendar went ahead and put Hanukkah. Yeah, that's not a feast of the Lord. That's a feast of the Jews. And Purim was actually up here in the month of Adar. So it would have been about our February or March. He didn't put that one on there. No, that's kind of interesting. It is a lunar agricultural calendar, as opposed to being a solar calendar that we have. You ever thought about this? Genesis 1 and 14. Then God said, let there be lights in the firmament of the heavens to divide the day from the night, and let them be for signs and seasons, and for days and years. And let them be for lights in the firmament of the heavens to give light on the earth. And it was so. Have you ever noticed how there's two phrases? And I kind of put them in color there. Signs and seasons and days and years. It's talking about the lights in heaven. The sun and the moon. So what I think he's trying to say is signs and seasons, that's in reference to the moon. The moon is what set God's idea of what the seasons were. What's in blue, days and years, that's the sun. The sun sets the days, the sun sets the year. It was the moon that set the seasons. Because that's where God said we need to start from. God's original calendar was based on the cycles of the moon as well as the Earth's revolution around the sun. I thought that was kind of interesting. Each month begins with the new moon. So I've got a picture here I'll show in a second. And the calendar was also tied to the agriculture of the area, namely barley and wheat. And I'll show you how that works together. There's the new moon, according to the Jews. That was the new moon. As soon as the first sliver of light could be detected, it was called the new moon. Well, they had to come up with some standard way to figure it out. That was the job of the high priest, as well as the Sanhedrin court. And so what they would do is they would have a pretty good idea when it was coming. They would watch for that moon. And on the night that they saw the first sliver, the high priest would say, that's the new moon. The Sanhedrin court would second it. And it's pretty neat. They would set fires up on the top of the mountains, and they would set a signal fire. And so then people further down, a couple miles down the road would see it, they would set a signal fire. And then a couple miles down the road, they would set a signal fire. And before too long, they had the whole country of Israel, the whole land, would be informed by signal fire that tonight is the night of the new moon. And that's when they started counting their months. It's kind of interesting, because the moon works on a 28-day cycle. That's why our months don't line up. Our months have 28, 30, or 31 days, and occasionally 29. The moon is 28 days. So there's always going to be a leeway of a couple of days. That's why when it says Passover was from March to April, that's why. Because our months don't line up. God said, I want you to count things off of the moon. 1 Chronicles 23:31, and at every presentation of a burnt offering to the Lord on the Sabbaths and on the new moons and on the set feast. Did you know those to be sacrifices on every new moon? The children of Israel celebrated the first day of every month. We have Sabbaths, new moons, and the feast days. And those three have tied together quite often. We're pretty familiar with the Sabbaths. By the end of this meeting, I hope we're familiar with the feast. But the new moon was just as important to God. He had that set on the new moons. That was important. So don't forget those three. Sabbath, new moon, or the appointed feast. In fact, there's two references I want to share with you. One's in Ezekiel. The new moon was the time. It was kind of customary for if you had a religious question, if you had a spiritual question, that's when you went to the tabernacle. That's when you could go talk with the priest or the high priest, was during the time of the new moon. So here's one, Ezekiel 46:1. Thus says the Lord God, the gateway to the inner court that faces towards the east shall be shut the 6 working days. But on the Sabbath it shall be open, and on the day of the new moon it shall be open. Pretty neat. The new moon was the day that people came in to discuss things with godly people. One more story. Do you remember Elisha and the Shunammite woman? You remember how Elisha was coming by and kept seeing this woman year after year, and she actually built a room in her house so Elisha could stay? And after a while, I'm kind of like Sarah, I suppose. The woman had a child. I guess she was kind of past age. She was very surprised by that. So she had the child, and a couple years later, one day the boy comes in and says, Mama, my head hurts, and lays down on his mom's lap, and he dies. And the Shunammite woman, she goes and she's going to go find Elisha. And Jerry Dickinson has a great sermon, if you ever heard it. They ask, is it well with you? Is it well with your husband? And is it well with the child? It's Jerry Dickinson. Let's look that one up. It's pretty good. But anyway, she says to her husband, 2 Kings 4:23, she says, I'm going to go find the man of God. And so he said, why are you going to him today? It's neither the new moon nor the Sabbath. Because the new moon was the day. It was very important in God's eyes. That's when the people went to discuss spiritual things with the priest and with the high priest and with the man of God. That's what they did. It was on the time of the new moon. And it's something that I don't think I've ever heard anyone discuss, the new moon. But it was very important back in antiquity. Here we go. Exodus chapter 12. This is at the time of the Passover. This is when God's calendar was established. The Lord spoke to Moses and Aaron in the land of Egypt, saying, this month shall be your beginning of months. It shall be the first month of the year to you. Speak to all the congregation of Israel, saying, on the 10th day of this month, every man shall take for himself a lamb. And now we begin to talk about the Passover. So you probably pick up on that last part. Did you notice he said this is the first month of the year? And so God set when the month began. It was the day after that new moon. That was day number 1. And the Jews were, the nation of Israel was to count 10 days. And that's when the idea of the Passover started. So what month was it? Well, in the scriptures, there's 2 words for it. Abib and Nisan. And I'm probably mispronouncing both of those, but that's what I'm going with. Abib and Nisan. And so there's different phrases. Exodus 12:2, Exodus 13:4, Exodus 23:15 use the word Abib. Nisan is used in Nehemiah and Esther. So just kind of give you an idea of it. There is Abib. So we've already talked about the beginning of months, the first month of the year. Exodus 13:4 is describing it as the month of Abib. Exodus 23:15, speaking of the Passover and the Feast of Unleavened Bread, uses the name Abib. You might think, who cares? There's something neat to it, so I'm going to show you. Nisan Nehemiah, and Esther talk about the first month being the month of Nisan. So why did it change? And if you start studying this, sometimes it'll say Abib, and sometimes it'll say Nisan. Why? That's kind of interesting. The word Nisan was not used until after the return from Babylon. And what happened was, a lot of times in Babylon, all it took was 70 years. And a lot of the things that God had taught them had been forgotten. You know, it only takes one generation. It only takes one generation to lose the Word of God. And that's what happened when they were in Babylon. A lot of the words that they have that have special meaning, they got Babylonianized, for lack of a better word. They got transferred and assimilated into the Babylonian culture. And that's what happened. The month of Abib now became Nisan, which was a derivative of this word up here. And again, I'm not going to try to say it, but I'll tell you what it means. Abib literally means young ear of barley or green. So you know when God's calendar started? When the little shoots of barley came up and they turned green. That's when the month started. That was Abib. Isn't that neat? It was when the green started on the barley, the next time you had a new moon, that started God's calendar. So it wasn't always in March. It wasn't always in April. There was a little bit of leeway for it. God's calendar was based off of the moon and off of the barley crop. Who'd have thunk it? Kind of interesting, isn't it? Now, Nisan, that means the month of flowers or beginning. And so it was in about the same time. But the meaning of God's month was changed because they spent too much time in Babylon. All it takes is one generation to lose the power and the meaning of God's word. Don't ever forget that. Teach your children. Teach your grandchildren. All it takes is one generation. So Abib seems to be the more proper term when we talk about the Feast of the Lord. So, Feast of the New Testament. Have you ever stopped to consider some of the events that transpire on these holy days? And the Bible is usually very plain to discuss, and we just have, a lot of times we skim right through it and we don't notice it. And it's almost as though the writers are trying to give us a hint. Wake up. It was on the Feast of Tabernacles that this happened. It was on unleavened bread. And I think so many times we've missed it. Did you realize that the crucifixion transpired on one of the holy days? Did you realize that the burial of Jesus occurred on one of these set feast days? Did you realize that the resurrection occurred on one of the feast days? Did you realize that the establishment of the church occurred on one of these feasts of the Lord? The events of John 7 and 8. There's a second part of your homework. Read Leviticus 23, and by the end of our meeting, skim through John 7 and 8. It's important. These two chapters, these events occurred on the feast of the Lord. And there's so much meaning because the substance is of Christ. This was not coincidental. They all have meaning. They all make connections. I believe there's so much more to the feast of the Lord than what the average person realizes. And I learned so much in this study, and I hope I can impart some of this to you. It's extremely, extremely interesting. Israel fell. The nation of Israel fell. Over the years, the feast of the Lord had become neglected. The nation was not serving them the way they were supposed to. To be honest, I don't know if they observed any of them the way they were supposed to as years went on. Innovations, disrespect for God's word had caused God to reject their worship. And I'm here to tell you, if God rejected their worship because it was insincere, God will reject our worship if it is insincere as well. We need to always consider what God expects. Let me give a couple verses. Hosea 2, verse 11. I will cause all her mirth to cease, her feast days, her new moons, and her Sabbaths. Remember the three? Feast days, new moons, Sabbaths. All her appointed feasts. Verse 13. But me she forgot, says the Lord. They were not observing these feasts like Leviticus 23 had told them to. Do you remember the story about King Hezekiah? King Hezekiah had a Passover during his time. And it says the Passover hadn't been celebrated for years. You remember the story of Josiah, the king, and he had found his workmen were remodeling up here, and somebody found a copy of the book of the law, dusted it off, and found, oh man, we're supposed to be doing the Passover? Well, what is this? We're supposed to be doing the Day of Atonement? They had not been doing any of it. And it says there hadn't been a feast like that in many years. That's because they forgot. Isaiah 1, verse 13, God has had it with the nation of Israel. Bring no more futile sacrifices. Incense is an abomination to me. The new moons, the Sabbath, and the calling of assemblies. I cannot endure iniquity in the sacred meeting. Your new moons and your appointed feast my soul hates. They are a trouble to me. I am weary of bearing them. See, God had established his feast, and the nation of Israel had blown him off. And they had quit doing what they were supposed to do. They were not partaking of the feast like they were supposed to. They were not taking it seriously. And God said, you know what? I've had enough of your new moons. I've had enough of your Sabbaths. I've had enough of your feasts. He says, I hate them. If we don't do what God says to do, I think we're in the same boat. God expects us to worship in a certain way. When we blow God off and we do what we want to do, I have a feeling God is sitting there thinking, I'm weary of your worship. I am tired of your futile sacrifices. I don't want to deal with it anymore. So I got you a couple questions now. Here's your quiz as we wrap up our overview. Number one, what determined the first month of the year? Remember? It's when the barley shoot turned green. When the barley shoot turned green, the next new moon started the first month. What was the name of the first month? I'm calling it Abib. Later on in the Bible, we will read Nisan. I'm calling it Abib because that meant green ear of barley, literally. What determined the new month? It's the moon. When the new moon came, that's what started the second month. Number three, what chapter in the Bible is most important for the study of the Feast of the Lord? Leviticus chapter 23. It's boring reading, but check it out because it does. It enumerates the 7 feasts. Other places you'll find them here a little, there a little, kind of hodgepodge in Deuteronomy and Exodus. Leviticus 23 is what explains it the best. Number 4, how many yearly feasts were ordained in the law of Moses? 7. You can add Purim, you can add Hanukkah, those were not feasts of the Lord. There were also monthly feasts, that was the new moon. There were also weekly feasts and weekly sacrifices, that was on the Sabbath day. There were also multi-year celebrations. Remember the year of Jubilee was every 50 years. So God had all sorts of appointed feasts and remembrances, but there were 7 yearly feasts. Number 5, how many feasts required the male presence at Jerusalem? 3. Which ones? Let's see if I can do it off the top of my head now. It's Passover, and it was weeks, what we call Pentecost, and Tabernacles. Those were the 3. Very important. Sometimes in your reading, those 3 will be referred to as festivals rather than feasts because they had such an importance placed with them. Number 6, what about Hanukkah? Is that the Jewish Christmas? No. Hanukkah was the Feast of Dedication or the Feast of Lights. That was by rabbis, and that was found in the winter. And so the Bible says in John very clearly it was in the winter. He didn't want us to confuse these with the Feast of the Lords. Hanukkah, as well as Purim, was a feast of the Jews, not the feast of the Lord. Number 7, are any of the feasts mentioned in the New Testament? Yes. Nearly all of them. And so that's what we'll discuss in our next 2 lessons. A lot of crossover to the New Testament. Number 8, was God pleased with the feast in the time of Isaiah? No. He had had enough. In fact, he said, I hate your futile sacrifices. Don't bring them to me anymore. He had had enough because they had turned their back on him and were not doing what they're supposed to. Number 9, what lessons can we learn from how the nation of Israel treated the feast? I think this was pretty clear. If God rejected their worship because they wouldn't do right, God will reject our worship if we don't do right. And if we try to do our own thing, then we're no different than the Jews and how they took the feast of the Lord. And finally, what New Testament passage describes the feast as the substance of Christ? It's Colossians chapter 2, and it's verses 16 and 17. And we'll start each one of our lessons with that. And that's our overview. It's fascinating. I've had more fun studying this and trying to figure out how this all fits together. And all of a sudden, you're going to begin to read things, and it's going to pop up, oh, wait, that fits in with the feast. And so I hope I can at least pique your interest over the next couple of days. Tomorrow, we're going to talk about the spring feast. So invite some people. It's nothing, it's just good education. And I think anybody that hears it is going to get something out of it. I don't care how little you are, how old you are. You're gonna learn something as we do our study. We have opportunity, though, to do something wonderful, and that's to offer anyone help of the church at this time. Everything points to Jesus. Everything points to the Christ, and because of that, we have opportunity to be heirs, joint heirs. We have the right to be children of God. But if there's ever anything we can do as a church, we have the ability to help one another, pray for one another. If there's anything we can do at any time, we stand ready to assist now. We have a song to teach.